Welcome to the WimLex show, episode number 25, today with Paul Kemp Robertson from Contagious. Contagious believes that creativity wins. In fact, when it comes to successful marketing, creativity kicks the living crap out of non-creative work. It's that simple. That's what Paul wrote on the contagious.com website, and that's what we are talking about. If this is really true, where are the good examples of marketing today? What are worst practices of marketing today, and can it be applied to B2B marketing? The WimLex show is presented to you by Debt Agency and Spryker Systems, the e-commerce technology everybody in Europe is talking about right now. The moderators are Lena Hackeler, based in Stockholm, Wilhelm Blom, based in Amsterdam, and me, Alexander Graf. Now please learn why marketing needs more creativity. Hi Paul, welcome to the WimLex show, today out of a camper in Amsterdam. We are talking today about marketing and what you found out about marketing with your agency. So please tell our listeners who you are and who you're working for.
Okay. Well, hello. Thanks for having me. My name is Paul Kemp Robertson. I'm based in London, and I'm the co-founder of a company called Contagious. And we were founded in 2004. So my background was working in the trade press within advertising and then working within advertising agencies. And I just kind of figured that at the time there was a bit of a disconnect between the way that consumers have suddenly started behaving in terms of how they were creating content, moving away from traditional advertising. And we just felt there was space within the advertising industry to create a kind of satellite navigation guide for the future of the business. So I think when we started, things like Facebook and YouTube were bubbling up. They weren't quite fully fledged companies. Phones were starting to get a little bit more smart. And I just felt that the kind of trade press and advertising industry hadn't really adjusted to the fact that there was a lot of activity going on 180 degrees away in terms of new startups, new behaviors, and so on. So we set up an editorial resource called Contagious. Originally it was in magazine format with a DVD kind of folded in.
When was it?
2004.
2004 still was a time when a magazine with DVDs was
it's a big deal. Well, I think that allowed us. Originally we were thinking, well, we should go digital because everything was moving towards digital as a platform. But we figured that by having an editorial product in physical paper form, that became our brand. So we spent a lot of money, time, and investment building a quarterly magazine that was quite kind of beautiful, but also editorially quite rigorous, and it was this kind of thing where we felt people would remember us. It was our brand message as well as a communication platform. And the concept was, look, there's so much kind of change and disruption, a lot of noise, a lot of opinion. We will look at 1,000 things and we'll talk to you about maybe less than 100. So we'll filter it down. We'll look at stuff that's creative, effective, innovative, that is going to drive the industry forward, that you can learn from. So I think the original premise was that, basically creativity kicks the crap out of non-creative work. It's effective, it's efficient, it makes fame for your brand, and so on. So it's worth kind of focusing on that kind of 1 to 5% of output from the advertising industry, because that's the stuff that's basically changing the world, changing categories, moving consumers into different directions, and so on. So, yeah.
So who you helping? Do you help other agencies to do better marketing, or you help brands to find out what kind of marketing strategies work for them?
But both, to be honest. So we sort of position ourselves as an intelligence and advisory resource. So the way that, obviously, this is 2004, that we were a kind of £1,000 a year B2B resource. And the reason that we could charge that sort of amount of money was because of the DVD, because we would look, as I say, maybe focus on 100 campaigns and really dig very deep and look at the challenge facing the brand.
So you had to pay €1,000 to buy your magazine per year.
Yeah. So as a subscription. But the value of the subscription really lay in what sat in the DVD, which is also available on the website. So that's like we've filtered, we've trawled, we found, like, we're saving you a lot of time by looking at, as I say, 1,000 things and focusing on just the very, very best. That was always our kind of mission. But we looked at what the challenge facing the company, what the solution was from a creative and media point of view, but also the effectiveness. So right from the very start, that was something that was drilled into me when I worked at Lea Burnett for 6 years, was that correlation between creativity and effectiveness. So we weren't just showing ideas for the sake of it, that were jumping on bandwagons, that were quite gimmicky. It was all about, right, this has to be rooted in a strong business strategy as well as, having kind of results out of that creativity.
And what had changed so far? So if you look back in 2004, when you first realized YouTube is going to be very successful, I think that was in 2004, a YouTube person wasn't called influencer like today. It was video blogger.
Yes.
And then I think Facebook became famous in Germany 2007, 2008, though it wasn't even there in 2004. And if you look at your customers today, what has really changed? Do they really change their marketing approach, or is it just their approach on how they measure channels and how they split their marketing money to TV, radio, Facebook, which is now dying.
Don't tell them that.
It's now into Instagram or TikTok or others.
Yeah, exactly. I think what we found is that it's an incredibly complex time to be working in marketing. I think it's the most kind of challenging, one of the most challenging roles that there is, because there's been so much diversification and new channels and so on. So what we found is that if you look at the role of a marketer pre-2004 versus now, just that what they're expected to know and to keep their hands on is incredible. So you've still got the traditional forms of mass media advertising is very much part of the job. It's still about making your brand famous, and you can do that through reach and mass market, being part of the culture. But then equally, there are now all of these other platforms. So I think, that from an executive point of view, being a marketer in the current climate is probably one of the most challenging jobs around, because there's also that demand from CEOs and CFOs for constant kind of quarterly results and reporting and so on. So I think that what works best, is when you kind of prioritize people. I mean, it's something that we talk about in the book that we wrote last year, The Contagious Commandments, where we find that the best ideas are not those that are sort of focused on, right, what are our KPIs? What's in it for us? Let's ask what's in it for them. If you make marketing ideas that feel a bit more reciprocal, that people can kind of have an opinion on and share.
People like the customers you want to win for your brand then.
Yeah, and I think also that the actual definition of advertising has started to change, so that it's not obviously, for a long time it hasn't just been this kind of monologue from a distance. It's much more two-way, much more dialogue. But I think that the best kind of advertising approaches are where you start to build maybe experiences for customers, consumers, people. I hate the word consumers. We try and avoid it as much as possible.
If I was a CFO from a bigger brand, following the discussion here, I would say, yeah, that's nice for people, but eventually you want to make revenue. So please tell me how much from my total revenue I should spend on marketing, on which channels, and then we figure out what kind of creativity stuff can be made per I think channel.
There is still a big chunk which is now focused on really targeted hyper personalization, where there is a definite feedback loop in terms of effectiveness and results. So I think a lot of brands are now moving into personalization at scale, and that's across, kind of digital platforms and mobile platforms. I think it's early days. I think it can work. I think if you get the targeting, really kind of well-defined, well-nuanced, and it's relevant, and there's kind of a reciprocal agreement there. I think where you start to lose possibly some of the long-term benefits of advertising is by just this relentless focus on the short term. I think that it's a question of balance. So I think, there's practitioners, say in the UK, there's the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising, and they do all these studies looking at the correlation between creativity and effectiveness and stuff. And something that sort of keeps coming out is that there has to be a balance, between, they sort of recommend 60-40 between long-term, famous, brand-building advertising that's going to kind of, go across the traditional channels and make your brand
kind of awareness building, top of the funnel.
Yeah.
Okay. And the 40
and then the 40 is more of the short-term, the programmatic, But I think the more you sort of get involved in personalization, which is where that...
Can we stick here, like for a minute? So, because it gives I will take like devil's head here and try to put me in the position of a CFO.
Right.
Like this 60-40, where does it come from? Because if I was a CFO, I would say, fuck awareness. Yeah. Right. So I only want results and selling stuff. And Paul, by selling stuff, it also creates awareness. Why should I invest in big ad space in magazines or on the street? I'd like to go
TV
100% performance based.
Right.
So I'd rather go like 10% awareness, 90% sales.
Right. I think if you focus relentlessly on the short term, then it becomes like this dog chasing its tail, because it's all about results. And then if you manage to kind of have a successful sales activation, then how do you keep on consistently delivering? Sometimes that means if your competitors start to replicate what you're doing, you've got to sort of cut again, do discounting and so on. And I think in the end, you sort of lose that impact of long-term brand building. We talk about, Contagious, this theory of what we call agile long-termism, I think is the best sort of solution for companies. It's something like Amazon are brilliant at, for instance, you think that they have a very strong organizing principle. It's something that we kind of focus on a lot in our book. It's like for chapter 1, basically, is like brands who've got a very strong organizing principle, which is their North Star. It's their reason for being. It's why we're here. So if you look at something like Patagonia, the clothing company, their actual organizing principle or mission statement is to use the business, the money they make through business to help save the planet. That's like a very bold, ambitious kind of mission statement. Everything they do is focused around that, which then allows them to get into all sorts of new areas that take them away from just traditional kind of brand building. So they've done things like make the world's most sustainable beer, for instance, because they think the industry's not doing it, so we're going to show you how to do it. So they've created this beer that's uses a slight particular grain of wheat that is longer. It doesn't mean that the topsoil's not cut up, it sequesters carbon and so on. So they're saying, like, we're going to give you an example to the rest of the industry. Off you go. They've now started challenging Donald Trump. They're suing the US government administration because they're trying to open vast tracts of land in America. So all these sort of state monuments, state national parks are suddenly open and available for fracking and commercial exploitation. And Patagonia are actually challenging the government, saying the president is stealing your land. They're backing Democratic candidates who stand in states that are being threatened by the government.
Do you think it's a smart move? It's a smart move to get mixed up into political discussions as a brand?
I think that the way society is so fractured, there's so many extremities between left and right and politicized cultures and so on, that I think that brands have to take a point of view. I think that, to me, the strongest brands and the ones with the kind of most sort of powerful cultures over the long term will get involved. I think Patagonia is, on one extreme. But I think people want to relate. They almost kind of respect brands, that they feel they can trust them. As if you look at what happened with Nike, for instance, on the Colin Kaepernick debate, is that Phil Knight, their founder, came out and said, look, if you don't stand for something, you stand for nothing. It's better to have people with you, and those that don't believe in you, we don't need them. I think that's where, if you stand for nothing, you're going to have no one following you, kind of thing. And I feel as though brands are in this weird, unique position because they have a lot of cultural power through, their media dollars, their positions in supermarkets, in people's consciousness, that they've got a position to actually take a point of view on stuff, anything from sexual equality to politics to race. And I think that.
So you say better get into discussions with the risk of losing some customers instead of not being mentioned at all.
Yeah. And also potentially those customers that you do kind of appeal to will stay loyal to you because they believe in what you stand for and so on. So,
got it. And you've tried to summarize some of your learnings in your book. So, and assume I'm like the not so smart CMO, former CFO.
Right.
Trying to understand what kind of principles I should apply for my consumer brand, and maybe we can have after you summarize your principles a small discussion about B2B marketing. This can be applied there too. But what is it about? Can you tell me a little bit?
Okay. Well, the book is called The Contagious Commandments. The subtitle is 10 Steps to Brand Bravery. So we think that creativity has got a disproportionate effect. So therefore, the book is about trying to encourage marketers to take calculated risks, in terms of how they deploy creativity, and that's across every media channel and so on and experience. So it's basically 10 principles that will help them get there. So from anything like, the first chapter I mentioned is to have an organizing principle. So that's a very, very strong sense of why we're here, what we do. It allows you to be kind of agile in the short term, but very, very concentrated with that long-term strategy. So an example would be Amazon. Their organizing principle is to be the most customer-centric company in the planet. So everything that they do is around convenience and speed. That's relentless. They're never going to change from that. But what that policy does is then allow them to take risks and experiment. So if you think about what they're doing with retail and 1 hour delivery, they're looking at drones. They're getting all these sort of patents for blimps where now they can actually start to anticipate people's needs and almost have like drone delivery systems in the sky. But they're also prepared to make mistakes. So things like those dash buttons that they did where you can suddenly stick a dash button on your washing machine that through a NFC, Bluetooth technology, every time you run out of washing powder, you click it and it orders some washing powder for you. Things like that didn't work, but they're prepared to take risks in the short term. We look at how do you weaponize your audience, I think is another kind of important chapter where we're saying, well, look, people who, in the world of, influencers and social media and so on, it's good to feel as though you're connected, that you've got access to material, that you want to be seen to be the first to get stuff or to have exclusive experiences. So as a brand, what can you give your people that are interested in you? Content, platforms, invitations, experiences that they can have, which then kind of amplify your brand because they will tell you, spread your message and talk about and so on, but also feel like as though they're involved in the brand. They have a perspective and a point of view. We have another section looking at things like, which is what I'm going to be talking today at the festival about, is heretical questions. I think it's a very powerful kind of position to have. Is that I think by asking unorthodox, difficult questions, it's how you stand out within the category.
For example, can you give an example?
Yeah, so some of the cases we've got would be something like Burger King, for instance, in the US. So they're a challenger brand to McDonald's, and they had this very simple brief, which was to get people to download more apps, because they're realizing that as a trend and within the food sector, more and more people are online ordering the food. So, and if they're not in that space and they're not growing in that space, then they're going to lose their competitive edge. But obviously they're against McDonald's, which has got twice as many restaurants as them in the US. So what I love, and this is where we sort of talk about the way that advertising is evolving and becoming more innovative, is that their CMO, who spoke at one of our events last year, was saying that if he's not given ideas that keep him awake at night or ideas that he needs to talk to a lawyer about, he rejects them. He's not interested. So it's a really powerful position to take.
That's a good rule for marketing. I know. Where they're a legal department.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they did an idea, for instance, where FCB, one of their agencies in the US, basically said, right, we have this fantastic idea. And again, it takes a lot of time, energy, logistics, and risk, where they said, right, we have this idea that in order to download a Burger King app, we are going to geofence something like 14,000 McDonald's restaurants. So the heretical question is, can we drive our business by sending our consumers to our biggest competitor? So what happened was they geofenced these restaurants so that if you downloaded the Burger King app within 600 meter radius of the McDonald's, it would fire up, recognize where you were through the geolocation and allow you to go to the nearest Burger King, which they could direct you to via maps, and you could buy a burger for $1. So that was the sort of provocative, brave move. So you end up with situations where you've got people walking to McDonald's going, where's the nearest Burger King? And trying to ask for flame grill whoppers in McDonald's. It really worked because what happened, it generated a lot of hype. So people talked about it. It got on the news. It got on CNN, the usual kind of stuff. But what they found happened from an ROI perspective is that people would rock up with the app at their local Burger King, get their burger for $1. They'd have 4 friends with them. They'd buy a drink, whatever. And they found that their sort of ROI on that campaign, it was only like an 8-week campaign, was about 27-1, which is phenomenal. And what they found was that the long-term direct ROI was 27.1.
So not including like the long-term effects of the campaign.
No, that was the actual sort of sales activation. But what they found was they were like number one app in the category for weeks and weeks afterwards. That there was the residual benefit that people actually had the app on their phone. That's what the ultimate brief was. And in the olden days, that would have been a radio ad, a TV ad, the usual, whereas now that's the challenge with facing the advertising industry is to come up with these ideas that are brave and provocative distinctive and stand out. But people love it because there is that, you think, and this is why it's good from a B2B perspective as well, is that ultimately humans are humans. You know, they love a challenge. They love, you know, kind of doing something different. And I think people actually love the quest of unlocking this thing, and they would tell their friends and share photos and whatever. So it became a campaign that people could co-opt into. So the amount of stuff around Instagram and WhatsApp or whatever about people getting into this campaign was actually quite interesting, I think. So
that's cool. Okay, that was the third principle. We have one or two main competitors in our B2B industry. I need to think about that. But that's like a strategy where you need really lots of customers then it works out. If you're like in B2B, you often target like only 1,000, 2,000 people per region, then it doesn't work out.
Right. Well, no, then you look at niche interests, and you look at, I think within that sort of space, you would think as a brand, well, what can we do that we can offer unique experiences? I think that's another thing that a lot of people really kind of almost expect from brands now, I think. So that is something where it's kind of easy to scale at a smaller level. So say if you've got 1,000 key customers that you're chasing, then what could you do to them that no one else is doing? What privileged access can you give them to an event, or I don't know, something? So you start to look along those kind of lines. What are their interests, and how do we tap into that? You know, so you look at the passion points.
I try
and treat people as people.
I still try to figure out what is like the CMO, former CFO, needs to do right now. Though one of the main problems, and we just talked before we started the podcast about it, that there's now so many channels and so many people that try to scream into the market and try to convince customers. The app industry, for example, you have to invest a lot, like marketing for your app in the app stores itself, just that it shows up. Then there's so many pirates trying to grab your spot by trying to create an app with a similar logo, similar naming. So it's very hard to reach the customer. So is there an answer for that? Is there anything you could focus on today? Because like the common principles are getting so fast, common principles now, that every strategy that involved a lawyer like last week is now like a strategy everybody does in the industry.
Right, everyone starts to copy.
And then it's going to die like in 2 weeks.
Right. I mean, some of it boils down to the fundamentals that will never ever change, is that what does your company, your app, your service offer that is better and different? So I still think it's like you have to focus on making sure that you're the best.
But that's not working out, because let's take your example with Burger King and McDonald's. Yeah. The Burger King burger is not better at all.
Well, they would argue it is, because it's flame grilled and so on.
The strategy of marketing was cool.
Right.
So the product did not need to be better. That's a cool thing, though. That's a very good strategy. If you have a better product, then you can probably rely on traditional channels.
But what I mean is that you've still got to fundamentally have a decent product in the first place. So don't lose sight of that and invest time and energy in that. Yeah. When it comes to all of the competition, I mean, it's tricky because it's an absolute swamp out there. So what we talk about is to try and, how do you think about creating blue ocean space? So if you're talking about that red ocean where everyone's, competing, whatever, is to come up with ideas where no one else is. So, I mean, it's very hard to compete in the App Store in terms of lookalikes and so on, but it's almost like you've got to get people's attention to actually want to go in and find you in the first place. So what can you do outside of the App Store? What kind of ideas how could you target people that you're interested in a different space where they're not expecting you, where your competitors aren't? I think that's sometimes a way to go. So, I don't know, an example, slightly tangential, but in the book we talk about, from France, from a supermarket. Actually from an airline who collaborated with a supermarket. So the airline is Transavia, which is a kind of budget, a bit like EasyJet. It's kind of a budget airline out of France and Belgium, I think. And they were finding that when it came to, people booking, so they would go online and try and book a flight. Yeah. Once you start to look at flight options, you get lost in this absolute kind of red ocean of price competitive hell, as they called it. So they would be competing against like 10 other competitors. It's all about price. It's all about lowest common denominator. It's all kind of, a race to the bottom. So they're thinking, right, how do we get away from this bloodbath? So they had this idea where they collaborated with Carrefour, and that's where I think a lot of potential options exist within the B2B space just as much as the consumer space, is that it's that 1 + 1 = 3 argument. What can you do as a brand by collaborating with another brand outside of your space to get to a really interesting solution that benefits both of you? Yeah. So in this case, what Transavia did was they created a series of products, so like gummy bears, crisps, nuts, sodas, which they badged and branded as Transavia products, but they sold them within the supermarket, within like a dedicated space within the supermarket, and each thing would cost something like 35, 45 euros. So you're used to paying 3 euros or 4 euros for a bag of crisps or whatever. Suddenly it's 35, 45. But there was a city destination, so the gummy bears might be called Barcelona, the chips might be called Lisbon. But it meant that when you went to the till, the checkout, and bought them, it unlocked a code that was hidden in the packaging. And that code became a ticket. So you could literally walk with a bag of crisps that had Lisbon on it and take it to a Transavia check-in desk and fly to Lisbon with that product. So they were saying it was a nice way of kind of reframing. So a nice anchoring bias. They tried to have it where these displays were in the alcohol sections, for instance. So suddenly compared to a bottle of champagne, that was the same price as being able to fly to Paris. So they found that they got a lot of attention. They got some new customers. They got the sense where Transavia were not competing against 10 other airlines in this space. So things like that as an example shows you that you can get, and the supermarket benefited because they got,
new products. I have one last question, again for the CFO.
Right.
So let's assume we have agreed on the split awareness versus, specific selling budget. I would rather go with 30% awareness now as a former CFO and selling. If there are other splits you can, in general, recommend? So when it comes to traditional channels, radio, TV, whatever, and pure digital channels?
I think the way it's gone, because it has been this relentless focus on short-termism and programmatic and hyper-personalization, that it's almost, to me, it should be 75-25 in this sense that 75 should go on awareness, and 25 on short-termism, because ultimately I think that you have to think about fame, and you've got to think about, that kind of logging the memory and the association that people have around your brand in people's heads, because they've got a huge amount of choice. And I think you've got to build a mass, because people aren't as loyal as you think they are. They'll be driven by, kind of sales offers and promotions and so on. So it's almost like, well, how do you keep in the long term investing in that brand and making it stand out? So when people do come to make a choice and they can see various options, it's like whatever memory structure they've got in their head, whatever association, still has an impact. And I think that's something that people lose sight of. So it's almost like, I agree that there is a benefit to hyper-targeted, kind of personalization at scale if it's relevant. But ultimately, where brands, I think, I'm talking from a consumer brand point of view, where they work best is where they're sort of part of culture, they're part of the cultural conversation, they're part of, they have a social kind of agenda and so on, and that comes from fame. It comes from being part of a conversation. So if you're given an experience that is so individual, so targeted, you can't talk to anybody about it. It doesn't mean anything. So you've still got these moments. It doesn't have to be a TV commercial, but I still think that there's very little else in the world that has got so much kind of emotional, creative and communicative power as that 30 seconds of film, or it could be a YouTube video, it could be whatever. But those are the things that imprint in people's brains. They can talk about, they can share, and that sometimes gets lost in the argument about this rush towards,
I will discuss that with our CFO. I will listen what you tell.
I'm talking from a consumer point of view. I mean, I think from a B2B point of view, it's probably a slightly different ratio. But why, I think why not try 50-50, for instance, so that rather than obviously I'm not saying about going creating TV commercials, but it's looking at alternatives, it's looking at experiences, it's looking at partnerships, it's looking at, just trying to do stuff that feels a little bit unique. That sometimes, some of the stuff that we talk about in the book, it takes a lot of work and a lot of attitude and energy, and it feels as though you're smashing the status quo or doing stuff that's different, and that's hard because I think people hate uncertainty. They're sort of hardwired to avoid risk and so on, but sometimes it's those ideas that are a bit maverick that do stand out can pay off kind of disproportionately in the long run.
I need to think a little bit about that, if this is applicable to B2B. I think yes, partly. But still, maybe have like the CFO heart a little bit more louder inside.
Right.
Paul, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with the Depth Festival
Thank you.
today. Maybe we can do a follow-up on B2B.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks you very much.
I hope you liked that episode, and now you're buying the book, The 10 Contagious Commandments, 10 Steps to Brand Bravery, authored by Paul Kemp Robertson and Chris Bass. And in the next episode, you can listen to the founder of Hello Print, Hans Schäfer, and we are talking about the online printing platform business. There are not so many platforms in Europe. He grew his platform to over 50 million in revenues last year, and he's growing at a staggerous rate. And it's very interesting what he has to say about the online printing industry. See you back.